So, thank you for joining us today. My name is Braden Mulhook. I'm the director of the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences here at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. And I'm happy today to be introducing Dr. Oluwatobi Ife-Adediran, who we affectionately know as Toby. Toby has a PhD in nuclear radiation and health physics from the Federal University of Akure and is a PhD student here at the Graduate Theological Union in the Theology and Ethics Department, where he's also been able to connect with faculty in the Nuclear Sciences Department at UC Berkeley. While he seeks to develop a constructive theology that is relevant for nuclear weapons and nuclear waste conventions in his current study, Toby continues to advance his interests in nuclear peace advocacy, technological ethics, social justice, and radiation protection. Today's public forum, entitled Nuclear Justice, Peace, and Sustainability, Theo-Ethical Matters Arising, is a part of CTNS's grant on climate science and theological education, sponsored by the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, or the DOSER program, of the AAAS. So thank you very much, Toby, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Braden, for the wonderful introduction. It's good to be here. I want to appreciate the DOSER program and the AAAS for this beautiful initiative. I think it's the way to go for theological education in its multidisciplinary outlook. Very critical for this age to support programs that of interest to the dialogue between theology and science. I'm a very strong advocate for extending that name to theology, ethics, science, and technology. Um, but that's a matter of nomenclature. And I want to thank the CTNS under the leadership of Dr. Braden and our very distinguished professors, Bob and Ted, for the oversight and the beautiful climate that you provide for CTNS students. In some parts of the world, scientists are still considered a little alien to, I mean, yes, in theological conversations. I remember during my Masters of Divinity, when I was researching the nexus between the church and science, many of my classmates revoked and said, no, you should be talking about the Holy Spirit or something else. I said, well, I'll be doing science and theology, whether you like it or not. So to be in a space as the GTU, where such conversations are taking the front burner is beautiful. And I want to say thank you. That said, I'm going to go ahead into the presentation that I have. There are a lot of experts here, um, distinguished professors, theologians, and scientists. So some of the things that I'm saying might not be entirely new, might be a kind of reminder, probably another invitation not to forget that we're still in the nuclear age, despite what artificial intelligence is doing to be in the front burner of many conversations today. Well, we still have a stockpile of about 12,000 nuclear weapons, so it's not over yet. So our professors who are retiring, we still need your voice, your contributions to make the world habitable despite the enormous power that is associated with nuclear technology. Um, I believe I have sharing permission, so I'll just go for it. Please let me know, maybe with a thumbs up once my screen is up. I see it up on my end. Thank you. So I'll jump right into it. Um, I've been recently working on, at least focusing on the subject of nuclear justice, peace, and sustainability. And that is what the talk today is going to be about, and particularly the theoretical dimensions of those and matters arising because I'm still a doctoral student at the GTU, and my professors are still helping me to frame my interest and research focus in this regard. But it is really interesting to continue to work on the nexus between the science and technology, ethics, and theological dimensions of the nuclear age. So a short bio, Dr. Braden has done justice. My name is Oluwatobi Ife-Adediran. I've been a physicist for most of my life, from originally from Nigeria, where I had my bachelor's of technology in physics, electronics. And for some reason, I decided to enroll for graduate programs in nuclear radiation and health physics, not the front line of nuclear weapons, nuclear power generation or reactor technologies, because at the moment we have only maybe one or two research reactors in Nigeria. We are working very closely with the IAEA to set up a commercial nuclear power plant. We're making progress, but that will still probably be a long shot. But I decided to focus on radiation protection, which is almost everywhere. Radiation occurs naturally. And at the same time, for Nigeria, that is a very notable oil-producing nation. We have radiation applications in the petroleum industry and in many other industries. So I decided to focus on protecting humans and the environment from the harmful effect of radiation. For 10 years, I was an assistant professor at the Federal University of Technology, where I studied for most of the time. And I also had some research work at the Institute of Radiation Protection and Radioecology of the Leibniz University in Hanover, Germany, where I was a visiting researcher for some time and also did part of my doctoral research in physics. Um, I also had some research visit at the National Geophysical Research Institute in Hyderabad, Germany, and I've worked with some other very beautiful people in different parts of the world. My interests are in radioecology and industrial radioactivity. So why did I bring that to the GTU? I had something different to do. I had a different plan when I applied to the GTU. Probably the professors who read my application will be able to testify to that. But just after spending 24 hours at the GTU, I arrived in the United States, and the next day I had to travel to leave for Germany for this summer school organized by Transense. And that was where the focus changed. So I've been working with the IRS in Hanover on the science and technology of the nuclear age. But for 2022, there was this emphasis on the transdisciplinary research. And the conversation was motivated by what was happening in the German society, where they needed to backtrack a little on the very rapid development in nuclear technology to focus on the social aspects. And not just the social aspect, but also the ethical conversations. And to my surprise, theological dimensions as well. So I went for the summer school just after 24 hours after being enrolled officially in the GTU. And that was where the interest in theoretical issues on the nuclear age emanated from. And in that summer school, in just one of the presentations out of so many, there was this evangelical academy known as Locum, and we can check them out. They were those who, this was the only presentation in that summer school that touched on the spiritual dimensions, and what the Protestant church in Germany was doing as regards public engagement. And it caught my attention. For some reason, it looked like the country had not paid adequate attention to public acceptance when it had to do with nuclear waste disposal, particularly. And there were not so many options in terms of land mass for the disposal of nuclear waste. It had to be somewhere close to local communities. And I'm glad that at that time, they took it seriously. in engaging those communities. And of course, some members of those communities were people of faith. There were religious institutions there. And so there needed to be some spiritual, theological dimensions to the matter of public engagement and public acceptance when it came to nuclear waste. And so I'm not going to talk too much about the academy, but to appreciate them for what they do. They thought it wise to learn from bad history, the failures of the churches during the World War II. They wanted to find a closer contact to the increasing secular society, and to contribute to the internal order of the society. And their concerns are in the slide. They feel responsible, this locum group, for social processes. They want to contribute to shaping social processes and in a democratic and pluralistic manner. So this is where my interest came from. And they consider nuclear energy and nuclear waste to be a topic for churches, something that in the theological space is, I find, from my own particular observation, that is becoming of interest. But I found many nuclear scientists being surprised that theologians are interested. So I think that there is a very strong need for this kind of roundtable conversation where ethicists, scientists, and theologians share ideas and exchange expertise in terms of this conversation. So as far as the evangelical academy is concerned, the nuclear energy and nuclear waste conversation is a topic for churches. And at least at that time, they were interested in the protection of humans and the creation. They were interested in high ethical values. And at least according to them, their interest is beyond political party lines. And we can see what that college looks like. On the left side of the slide, a theologian is the director, and we have a couple of other people who make up the locum. Okay, so that was where the interest came from. And then I decided that, well, I'm going to come back to the GTU. And even if I don't have all the ideas fully developed, I think I want to work on the nexus between nuclear technology, theology, and ethics. And I'm going to start just for the sake of those who don't have a strong scientific background, what I've called the fission fascination. And the fission fascination is summarily the fact that some radionuclides, some atomic elements can be bombarded with what we call neutrons. I know that's not a very interesting name for non-scientists, but in the process of this bombardment, some enormous amount of energy, fascinating to those who, Hahn and Strassman, who discovered radioactivity, um, is produced in this process. And at least there is one sister process known as the nuclear fusion that is still in development. But as of now, most of the benefits of nuclear energy and nuclear power production have come from the fission process. And that we'll see in the first picture, what happens in that little illustration. What is really beautiful is that with a small fuel input, and for the sake of comparison, about 10 grams of uranium oxide will produce the same energy output as 1 metric ton of coal. And as at 1939, when Hahn and Strassman discovered this, many years after radioactivity was discovered by Becquerel in 1896, and fission came much later. Well, again, like I said, the energy output was really enormous. It was a game changer. Meitner and Frisch were able to explain the theory of that process. And voila, in 1942, the first chain reaction, the first controlled chain reaction took place in what is known as the Chicago Pal 1 here in the United States. Not too long after that, we had the first nuclear weapons tests in Alamo Gordo, New Mexico, here in the United States, about 20 kilotons of energy output. And in that same year, quite unfortunately, we had the first and only nuclear weapons used in the Second World War in Hiroshima and Nagasaki of Japan. But thankfully, it didn't take too long for at least the United States and then many other members of the United Nations, which had been established, to begin to emphasize the need for for the peaceful utilization of nuclear energy. And even though till today, this is still a subject of conversation. What should be the emphasis? Peaceful use or a complete eradication? Um, as of today, my stance is peaceful use, but we still have a lot of people, particularly members of the public, particularly those who have not, and again, this is my own argument, people who have not been able to see the to engage in the multi-dimensional aspect of nuclear power. I think that most of those people, particularly those who are empathetic to public groups and to ethics and to liberation, would likely want to call for an eradication. And I think that this was also the position of the Roman Catholic Church at a point. I'm not very conversant with what it is at the moment, where they say that nuclear weapons and maybe nuclear energy as a whole is a moral evil. But I think that Eisenhower Dwight, the 34th president of the United States, thereabout, I hope I'm correct, made this very remarkable emphasis of atoms for peace. Again, this is just some history. I've talked about Chicago Pile 1, the first nuclear controlled nuclear reaction. The first nuclear power plant was actually in Obninsk of Russia in USSR as at then. Pardon me, in 1954, and then the British followed suit in 1956 with their Calder Hall power plant. The United States also had their power plant in 1954 as well, actually the same year with the USSR, but it was not connected to the grid until 1957. And that power plant was in Pittsburgh, close to Pittsburgh. And then we have the fourth one, I believe that's in the Netherlands, the Calham, Maine power plant in 1961. Since then, there's been a very beautiful, at least for scientists, advancement in nuclear reactor technologies. I think this is where ethics and theology need to catch up with the rate of advancement in reactor technologies. Reactors are identified as generation 1, 2, 3, 3 plus, and generation 4. Most of the improvements have to do with newer technologies. For today, we still have most popular, particularly in Europe and the United States, the generation 2 and 3 reactors, which are pressurized water reactors, boiling water reactors. Um, but there is a lot of work with the emphasis on reducing waste volumes and the radioactivity of this waste, which we can summarize as their detrimental effect. There is a lot of work going on in developing advanced reactors, particularly for reprocessing, what I will talk about later on. And even in the future, there are projections as well. So it looks like the conversation regarding the nuclear age has probably just begun. But just to underscore that there are remarkable improvements. Um, so these reactors definitely produce waste, and just for a kind of understanding, a unanimous shared understanding, waste as defined by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency in 1994, are hazardous. They contain radioactive materials, and radioactivity is because these atoms are unstable. Usually scientists will talk about the proton-neutron ratio, which I know is quite technical, but they emit radiation because of that instability. And nuclear waste contain these different radionuclides. Thankfully, maybe so to say, there are different categories of them. Not all of them are really, really terribly bad. Some of those wastes are low level, kind comparable in terms of detriment to waste produced in other applications of nuclear radiation. Some of them are intermediate, and the ones that are of particular concern at the high level nuclear waste, what is known as HLNW. Below to the right, we have just some categorizations of the sources of this waste. Some of them are spent nuclear fuel, which is what is gotten as the byproduct in nuclear power plants, particularly the traditional ones. But we have waste also from operational processes, filters, system components, protective clothing. We have waste from mining, the initial phase of getting the nuclear fuel. And even for decommissioning, let's even assume that the nuclear phase out, which started sometimes around 2000, year 2000, where there was more emphasis about closing nuclear power plants all over the world, even the process of phasing out will produce nuclear waste. So decommissioning produces waste, and then there are wastes that are produced from unplanned activities known as incident waste. Um, so this is a more detailed categorization, um, and the main differentiation between the categories of nuclear waste is their radioactivity. So high level, intermediate level, low level, very low level, very short-lived waste, and those that are exempt or clearance waste. So there are two things. There are basically two handling processes for this waste. One of them is the temporary approach, which has to do with storage. So by definition, storage is a temporary measure. The idea is to keep spent nuclear fuel, what we'll see as SNF, in some other slides in a facility that will contain them, which is basically isolate them from the environmental media or from people. And there are different kinds of this storage. We'll see in that second picture. Sometimes it's just a matter of decaying, most of the time to take off the heat from spent nuclear fuel. There is also what is known as buffer storage, which is usually to stock the waste for an ongoing process. Maybe the waste are being characterized or they're going to be transported. So there is a buffer storage. There's what is known as the strategic storage if the waste have potential future use, and there is interim storage, which is the more popular one. And this just shows the dry kind of storage and the wet storage. Usually wet storage is done in the reactor facilities to cool down the waste. They are usually really hot, and then they are now moved into dry casks, where because of the possibility of criticality, and criticality is just when the conditions are suitable for the fission process. So they are kept in very strong shielding materials. Convention is used to take off the heat, and they are confined. So wet storage, the example in Sweden is what we see in the picture to the right, and we see the dry storage also. But there is a need for a final, more permanent disposal of this waste. Why? To kind of make them more inaccessible and for safety reasons. So long as the waste exists beyond the surface, there are possibilities that there could be contaminations, whether man-made or natural. It could be even from natural disasters. So right from the get-go of nuclear technology, experts have always known that there will be a need to dispose this waste permanently. But while this is the final measure to keep this waste away, the idea is to make retrieval more challenging, but not impossible. Even for waste disposal or permanent disposal of nuclear waste, there is still room for this waste to be retrieved. However, the intention is that they will not be easily retrievable, and they will provide more safety and security. Different ideas have been put out for waste disposal. Interesting ideas, I must say. Um, and the comparison of the ideas, we will see in that um, the picture to the right, disposal at sea, environmental issues, because this is water, it flows easily, contamination is easier. Disposal in outer space. So some people have thought, hey, why don't we just keep this in space? Of course, that's going to be very expensive, I can tell. Safety may be an issue. What happens if on the way there is an accident, then there is easier spread of those waste materials. So there are different options. Some say in subduction zones, which is where tectonic plates meet. And some people feel that those wastes can be kept there. There are also ideas to keep them in seabed formations. But what has been the most agreed upon idea is to dispose them in geological repositories. And for geological repositories, there are also suggestions that, well, there could be a graded approach depending on the radioactivity, the severity of their detriment. We could have shallower options or to keep them in very deep repositories, particularly the high-level wastes. And there are issues, there are concerns and questions when it comes to even the agreement on deep geological repositories. One of them is the safety of staff and the general public. Safety is usually first, top of the conversations. There are ethical aspects, including the ethics that are relevant to the current generation and future people. There are very, very interesting technological dimensions as well. Societal and political aspects are also there. People are aware that, when they hear of the word nuclear radiation, there is trepidation. Although we enjoy the benefits, but people still feel very threatened, even by the mention of the name. So there are issues around governance, political feasibility, and acceptance. Cost also is very important. Who bears the cost for managing this waste? And if there are more than one party to bear the cost, how should it be distributed? And then what are the boundary conditions in this conversation? Should we have scientists dealing with the scientific dimensions and politicians doing their thing and the public and ethicists? And then how do these different stakeholders marry together to come up with solutions? Okay. Thank you, Ted, for that note. So that is one dimension. The dimension of nuclear waste, is one of them. The other one has to do with nuclear weapons proliferation, which I'm also interested in. In my ongoing doctoral program, one key challenge I've had is where do I want to focus on? Is it the waste dimension or the weapons proliferation? But I realized that there is an intersection, and we're going to see that later on. When we talk about the nuclear fuel cycle, we'll see that sometimes there is a trade-off between safety and security. So there is a strong point of intersection, but I'd like to introduce this other dimension of the nuclear age that I think is also relevant by showing this picture of the nuclear triad of air-based nuclear weapon systems known as the air-delivered bombs and cruise missiles, the submarine-based, the SLBMs, and the ICBMs, which are intercontinental ballistic missiles. So right from the first nuclear weapons test in July the 16th, I believe 1947, this chart shows the evolution in terms of the stockpile, the stockpile of nuclear weapons. And of course, the United States and the USSR or Russia have had the largest share of the stockpile. So I think that this is at least an important a reason why the comparison between the two countries is relevant. We could generally see an increase, particularly for Russia, represented by the red, or for the USSR, up until sometimes around 1991, when, this at the end of the Soviet Union. But I think thankfully for the United States, we see a decline way earlier, and then we see a general decline in the stockpile for the two countries close to the end of the chart. It's been quite stable in recent years, but from what used to be over 30,000 nuclear weapons, even up to over 50,000, 60,000 we will see in 1987. Now we have about 12,000 nuclear weapons. So at the moment, there are 9 nuclear weapon nations or nuclear weapon states. Russia and the United States still lead in terms of stockpile. North Korea, I believe, is the most recent, and they have the lowest of 50. But what are the things that have been put in place to record the success that we saw in the previous slide? That is the decline in the stockpile. The first one is the arms control, which basically has been achieved by treaties between the two most prominent nuclear powers. And we'll see some of those treaties in the previous slide. The SALT 1, SALT 2, those I came across during my policy lectures at the UC Berkeley. But some of those treaties were had remarkable results. Sometimes there was a need to revisit them, but we've had nuclear arms control where sometimes the two countries will say, "Hey, can we put aside nuclear weapons with this particular range or this particular capability?" And they come to an agreement to do that. The second one is the disarmament process, where some countries have been persuaded to put away their nuclear weapons program. Popular is Libya. Brazil and Argentina also had it at least as an idea, but through disarmament, or maybe not so much of disarmament, they were able to suspend their programs. We've had other countries as well. South Africa was also in the process of developing a weapons program, and they put that away. But the most popular of this is the non-proliferation, what is known as the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Currently, we have about 191, a remarkable number of countries in that treaty. At the moment, maybe about five countries are not there. India, Israel, Pakistan have never joined. South Korea left that treaty at a point. North Korea, pardon me, North Korea left the treaty. I think that the extended deterrence paradigm, or the deterrence paradigm of the United States, has led to this success, in the sense that there is an agreement between the United States and their allies, maybe in the NATO framework, or even for the allies, particularly in Asia and some other parts of the world, to provide support to those countries in the case of a nuclear threat or a nuclear aggression. The most recent that probably everybody on this call knows about is the counter-proliferation method, which we saw when the United States sent some bombers to Iran against the enrichment facilities that they had, most of which were in bunkers way below the ground. And I think that was in June or July this year. There was a strong counter-proliferation approach because of the suspicion that Iran was edging towards the nuclear threshold. There were suspicions that he had their enrichment, which has to do with preparing nuclear fuels for the production of nuclear weapons. Because there is a far cry between the enrichment process for peaceful use, particularly nuclear power, and the non-peaceful use, 4% to 90%. So once there is an enrichment process going on, there is the suspicion that the country is edging towards producing weapons, and the United States responded in a counter-proliferation strike. And then just to further mention, before we go into some ethical dimensions and theological conversations, what a research that some of my colleagues at the UC Berkeley and I did, just to examine the nuclear posture of in South Korea, and to think ahead what happens if a non-weapon state decides to produce nuclear weapons. We did a mini research, a kind of mini project on the nuclear posture of the Republic of Korea. And the question was, will the Republic of Korea at any point also develop nuclear weapons? As that when we conducted this research in 2023, we felt like it was just still a public conversation. The president of the country was still evaluating the extended deterrence of the United States, was evaluating the reliability of Washington's commitment to protect its ally. Um, and so at that level, it was still a public conversation rather than a decision. But what are some of the factors that influence or motivate or demotivate the nuclear proliferation? or a country becoming a nuclear weapon state. Some of them are external, others are internal, and then some of them have to do with demand or supply. So, in these factors, we see national security is always primary, particularly when rival countries are close and they probably have nuclear weapons. For example, for South Korea, we see some doubt on the US extended deterrence, assurance, threats from North Korea, and uncertainty of the geopolitics. We see domestic support, technological capability. So once a country is able to, leverage nuclear power for electricity or for other uses, it means that there is a tendency for them to be able to convert that for military purposes. Sometimes it's a matter of autonomy, at other times it's prestige, and so on and so forth. So we looked at some of the factors, particularly for the Republic of Korea. And then we were able to establish that there will be consequences. First of all, we feel like if Republic of Korea goes nuclear, it's going to increase the tensions, particularly in the peninsula. North Korea has always shown readiness to increase their stockpile. I would think that um, any, proliferation within their East Asian region may just result to that. There would be economic impact, definitely, possibly from China and then from the United States sanctions would be, applicable in that regard. I would think that it would be an affront to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, where countries have cooperated to a large extent. We feel like if a country like the ROK, decides to go nuclear, it's going to affect the credibility of that treaty. Here we looked at what the response of North Korea will be, given the increasing tests, nuclear tests that they have shown in that graph. We think that they are kind of ready to increase their stockpile. And so the Republic of Korea may want to take note of this in their decision making. We feel like Japan may not go nuclear. It looks like generally within the government and even the public, there is still a position to maintain their nuclear status. I've talked about possible sanctions. In South Korea, there has been a case where there was a sanction from China when South Korea installed what is known as the THAAD anti-missile infrastructure. In 2016, there was a sanction from China. China blocked market access of certain South Korean products. So we feel like if they go ahead to produce this weapon, there will be more sanctions from a country like China. And then if they do, they will be the fifth country that will not be part of the NPT. And that is going to have a very strong effect on an approach, a strategy that has been successful for a very long time. All right, so this was just to mention. Now we want to look at the theoretical perspectives, having laid this background of the scientific dimensions and what has been the issues of the nuclear age. And I want to take a cue from what Jim Walls said in 1988, that what to do with nuclear waste is a problem that requires a moral examination precisely because it is filled with uncertainty. We dare not resolve it without some sense of a higher purpose at stake. So James submits that there needs to be something beyond um, the scientific, something moral, and what he refers to as a higher purpose in the conversation around nuclear waste problem. And I saw this imagery on Facebook. I tried to get the source, I couldn't. But this is just what the stance is for some members of the public. Let's make our Earth a nuclear-free zone. But it's definitely not as easy as it sounds. Radioactive materials demand stewardship frameworks that account not only for scientific and technical adequacy, but also for justice, for intergenerational responsibility, public trust, cultural narrative, and theological meaning. Public controversies surrounding high-level nuclear waste repositories in countries like the United States illustrate that technical competence alone cannot secure societal consent. Rather, legitimacy requires transparent governance, participatory decision making, equitable compensation structures, and moral narratives that acknowledge communal identities and historical memories. So it is just way beyond the fascination of a technology, the history of the people, their moral framework. There are many things that are going to influence the acceptability. Of course, there was a time where we were so fascinated by how much energy we could get, but now it's really important to pay attention to these other dimensions. So this section integrates scientific analysis, ethical reflection, and theological reasoning in relation to high-level nuclear waste. And the first ethical framework I want to mention, and maybe the only one in this forum, is the idea of the common good. And I take a cue from Ted Peters, who had worked quite extensively on nuclear ethics. He talked about the idea of the common good. As far as Ted Peters is concerned, the idea of the common good is going to set the right tone for developing ethical responses to the issues that confront the nuclear age. And I'm going to read a part of the paper where I took this from. It says, the major ethical paradigm regarding citing nuclear waste considers the common good of society rather than self-seeking political interests, competing personal preferences, and individual priorities. What I'm reading is not on the slide now. I just put a summary. So we may want to, look at the slide and then maybe listen to catch some of the excerpts from that paper, all of which impose a limitation on the objective ethical evaluation of alternatives. Borrowing from Eric Voegelin's submission that there is oneness to the whole of human race and the order of society is more than the sum of interest of its individual members, Peters critiques cultures that relegate moral values to the personal or private realm, making it both relative and subject to individual choices and political lobbyists who take advantage of individual autonomy, thereby restricting goodness to the sphere of expressive individualism. It suggests that habits of the heart, that is, the moral, intellectual inclinations that shape the worldviews of members of a society, should be cultivated towards social good and unity, and he also recommends a panoramic appreciation of the common good across the human race as a whole. The unity of mankind corresponds to the universality of the one God. There can be no peace unless the community of mankind is given priority over national interests and other kind of group interests. We can no longer compartmentalize our crises. They cannot be limited to one nation or to one sector of life. For instance, the current ecological movements leverage the nexus between science and ethics, as the moral ecological vision of the common good recognizes that every ecological fact has an ethical significance. Economic oppression, injustice, or inequity manifested in the gap between the rich and the poor at different levels within a society, or even between different countries or nation states, contribute significantly to the quality of decision making in attaining sustainability. The quest to only enrich some will always be at the detriment of others, for it is only this way that the gap can be maintained. In fact, each generation seems to strive primarily for its own sustenance at the expense of the future other in a manner that threatens the possibility and the quality of their existence. The unsustainable way in which we pursue prosperity is the culprit. In addition, poverty and nuclear apathy are inextricably linked in a mutual cause and effect relationship. Economic poverty and the struggle for survival can layer nuclear concerns as non-immediate for the growing poor majority and shun their participation, shun their voices, and shun their contributions in a decision making that should both be holistic and inclusive. Western philosophy emerged from Platonic foundations of ancient Greece, which concerns which considers a desirable society as one that aligns itself with the good, known as the agathon in Greek. This agathon has a transcendental source and nature beyond personal preferences and finds its way into our personal existence from an eternal realm. Patristic theologian St. Augustine considered God to be the source of and the enabler of the good and calls for political actions that are motivated by our vision of the future city of God, which he referred to as the Civitas Dei. This future city, symbolized by the kingdom of God, provides a basis for ethical activities demonstrated in the inspiration to improve on the what is towards a new and the better. This argument was made by Wolfert Pannenberg. Peters considers the idea of the good as a transcendental solution to the problem of participation in intergenerational justice. Since the future generations are not currently engaged in decision making regarding disposal strategies, the invocation of justice in the presence of current persons and the absence of future people will require an inclusive canon that is beyond the temporality of personal existence and will involve the transcendental good. And so Peter quotes Wolfert Pannenberg in a statement that the universal nature of the Christian hope for a political order of peace and justice that will unite all humanity has the closest connection with democratic ideals. This is true, first of all, of the democratic principles. They are based on humans as humans, on all humans, not as the people of this nation or people of that nation or people of this social class or that social class. Thus, from the onset, the concept of the world citizenship is a vital part of democratic thought. This means, among other things, that participatory democracy is the form of government most consistent with the symbol of God's kingdom. So this is one of the frameworks, ethical frameworks that I find very relevant, that of the common good that can influence the development of ethical principles when it comes to the nuclear age or nuclear waste disposal. And what are some of these principles? Before we go there, I'd like to mention the NIMBY problem, the not in my backyard issue, which Peters also talks about in his book. The NIMBY is a public repulsion to the siting of facilities that are considered detrimental near the residence of people or that are considered dangerous. Yet, undesirable volumes of toxic matter must coexist with the humans that often produce them within the limited geographical space, especially limited landmass. Rather than being local selfishness, I argue that NIMBY is a rational local rejection of failed centralized justice mechanisms and an expression of the human instinct for self-preservation, which has become very threatened because of the mass destruction made possible with atomic energy, and as an expression of distrust in institutional and governmental decision makers. However, there is a need to address NIMBY to avoid NEABY, which is not in anyone's backyard. For if waste are not in anyone's backyard, then where would they be? Peters therefore suggests a whole part ethics that harnesses the intrinsic connection between individuals and the entire human community across generations in recognition of the inevitability of nuclear waste siting and the need for cooperation between communities, government, and industry. And then this takes me to some ethical principles. Having established the framework of the common good and the problem of not in my backyard, the first ethical principle is that of permanent safety. And the idea is that safety should be all encompassing across spatial divides as well as across temporal divides. However, radiation safety is usually not absolutized because of the justification principle for radiation exposure, weighs risk and benefit for decision making. Generally, radiation exposure should then be kept as low as reasonably achievable. The aim of permanent safety is the isolation of nuclear waste in a manner that guarantees the same measure of safety across spatial and temporal divides. I mentioned that earlier, Otherwise, if this cannot be achieved, then temporary storage that ensures monitoring and retrievability should be adopted. Crudely et al. Argued that safety and risk are the most critical concerns regarding nuclear waste siting for residents in potential host areas. Future generations therefore should be assured of as much safety as the current generation, who are responsible for developing technologies, initiatives, and management strategies. The second one is the technical or the technological criteria. Disposal sites should show the history of stable rock formations for at least tens of thousands of years and should have impermeable subsurface soil profiles and be isolated from groundwater flow. They should also be resistant to changes in their desirable properties, especially under loading conditions. And of course, modeling will be important in this regard. Some rock formations that have satisfied these conditions are those of alluvium, granite, shale, and salt. A few sites in the United States reasonably satisfy this requirement, and those are of the Yukon Mountains in Nevada and the salt domes of the Deaf Smith County in Texas. Political interest in the choice of disposal sites should be secondary to the technical qualities of safety and permanence. The third principle is that of the greater good, and there are two sub-principles that are relevant here. The first one is that radioactive waste siting should contribute to the good of the whole society or to the greater good of a greater number of people, somewhat utilitarian, and the concerns of those who are adversely affected should be duly addressed. Although the adverse effect of a waste repository on its host community is regrettable, it is not a sufficient reason to deter its establishment. In the case that the social and economic inequalities become unavoidable, what was stated in John Rawls' idea of justice as fairness, justice requires redress in the form of compensation. However, compensation becomes super compensation, an ethical problem if it is demanded by host communities, and it becomes extortion if it is offered by authorities. It becomes extorting or becomes bribery. So the idea is that compensation should offset the specific detrimental effects that siting nuclear waste may have to host communities. The next one is the protection of proximal communities. Residents of proximal communities should not be saddled with undue responsibilities. Residents near disposal sites should not be required to take risk that others may be unwilling to bear. This principle aligns with the golden rule of the Confucian worldview and teachings of many other religious traditions. Immanuel Kant also expresses a similar notion in his categorical imperative that one should only act on a maxim that can be, at the same time, considered as a universal law. The safety of host communities should be guaranteed to the extent that non-residents, especially stakeholders, will be able to take risk living in such proximal communities themselves. This is important for the protection of potential waste in my backyard population who prefer to retain their residence in communities or in potential host communities rather than sell them off and to relocate to new places. And we can see this picture of Fukushima, of the Fukushima community just after the Fukushima accident in 2011, how detrimental it could be. I mean, this doesn't have to do with nuclear waste disposal, but it is a picture that could come to mind when people in potential host communities think about the detrimental effect of having nuclear wastes close to them. Communication of risk to future generations is another principle. Future generations have a right to knowledge about waste hazards and its associated risk. Such information should at least include an on-site indication of a repository's content and status, a detailed description of its history and prospects that can engender further decision making, and the consideration of alternatives if future people so desire. The record should also reveal efforts that have been put in place to secure the sites from sabotage. The responsibility of reactor beneficiaries is another principle. Current users should be responsible for the cost of future site management, crisis mitigation, and as well as the cost of damage and recovery in the case of accidents. The beneficiaries of nuclear power should make a contributory investment that will serve as an endowment fund to support radioactive waste sites throughout the active lifespan. Funds will be channeled towards maintenance and accident insurance. And in the case that extra funds are accrued, they should be designated as a contribution of past generation towards the welfare of future people, the deployment of state-of-the-art technology. The best technology and management strategies should be consistently developed throughout the repository's lifetime to bridge the possible gap between ideal designs and shortcomings in their implementation. Peters calls for a code of moral practice which will encourage the highest quality workmanship over a long haul. Quality should not be compromised because of financial constraints. Regulatory standards, precautionary measures, and quality control must be maintained beyond the safety threshold, something that is really important, irrespective of the routines that are associated with them. While preparing for this, I saw one of the earlier nuclear weapons tests. The energy output was estimated at about 6 kilotons of TNT. And after the test, the test resulted to about 15 kilotons of TNT energy output, affecting more communities than had been estimated. So I resonate strongly with the idea that precautionary measures and quality control must be maintained beyond safety thresholds, irrespective of what will be required for that to be done. John Rawls's theory of justice insistence that the negative impact on certain communities, human and environmental, are tolerable if it is necessitated by a greater good to the larger society, and insofar the adversely affected groups are offered a means of redress and due compensation. However, since high-level nuclear waste exists for up to 500,000 years, it is ethically adequate to consider the adverse effect and compensation strategies through an intergenerational lens. And this leads me to the intergenerational dimensions of the ethical conversation. The intergenerational dimension borders on risk and the transfer of costs to the near and distant future, what Stephen Gardner refers to as the tyranny of contemporaries. Nuclear power plays an energy transition role between the conventional energy sources and the renewable sources. Yet, an increase in production of waste may compromise the well-being and flourishing of future generations. Regarding uranium deposits, which is really important, it can be argued that the current generation has enjoyed the largest share of the benefits of nuclear energy, making us primarily responsible for the associated burdens. For Rachel Moas, the fulfillment of this obligation is an expression of love by the current generation to their temporal neighbors, and this emphasis calls for Christian solidarity with the unborn generations who are currently powerless and voiceless. However, uncertainties about the future have been commonly identified as a hindrance to establishing intergenerational justice. William D. Ross delineates prima facie duties of beneficence, which is promoting well-being, and non-maleficence, which is avoiding or reducing harm. The beneficence duty is premised on Brian Barry's principle of responsibility and primary interest. That of responsibility suggests that those who experience the detrimental effects of any action to which they did not contribute should be adequately compensated. Its principle of vital interest suggests that the interests of current generations do not supersede the interests of those of the future. As a matter of fact, both the present and future generations have the same right to natural resources. What leads to the problem known as intergenerational resourcism. However, the issue of resourcism does not suggest that the current generation is expected to save all non-renewable resources for posterity. The question then is there a justifiable limit for resourcism? The response provided by Steven Zuber is that of sustainability, that even though current generations make use of those resources, they need to protect opportunities in terms of capital resources to meet the needs of future generations. Brian also identifies opportunity as a valid metric of justice that should not be narrowed or reduced for future persons. For Martin Golden, the current generation is obligated to create conditions of good living for the future. Berman-Taibi also expresses the rationale for compensation. We should compensate for a reduction in opportunities for well-being that would have been brought about by energy resources. There are some pushbacks to the intergenerational justice duty of beneficence. Some of them include the development of renewable energy options would mean that even in the absence of uranium fuel or resources, the well-being of future persons, is secured. But a counter pushback to this will be the question of optimism. If indeed renewable energy options will be able to cater for the needs or the energy needs of future persons. Another pushback is improved technologies for nuclear waste recycling, as well as the arbitrary comparison of well-being between generations. The second intergenerational issue is that of non-maleficence, which is usually viewed as a threat to safety and security in terms of contamination or weapons proliferation. For Taibbi, the safety of future generations is the most important factor. Taibbi leans on Just Stuart Mill's no harm principle that the sovereignty of individuals is preserved as long as they do not harm others. Other technology should be adopted if and only if there is convincing evidence that it will not cause severe harm to humans and the environment. Again, the pushback to this no harm principle is that it is a predicted non-maleficence that can only be fully established by the experience of future generations. In comparing these two intergenerational duties, contemporary philosophers like David Ross, John Rawls, and Daniel Callahan consider the obligation of non-maleficence to be more crucial than beneficence because it has a bearing over a much more longer period, which is particularly the lifetime of the waste than that of beneficence. However, these two duties are chronopolitan. They do not extend to all generations. And so Avner the Shalit argues for intergenerational duties towards the close and immediate future, rather than the idea of discounted utilitarianism, which suggests that the interest of the future should be completely discounted in the ethical conversation. This conversation around intergenerational justice has a very strong linkage with technologies, what I refer to as nuclear fuel cycles and their intergenerational linkage. There are three cycles that are relevant to this conversation. The first one is the open cycle or the once through cycle. And the statement by Taibbi is very profound here. It says intergenerational ethics is a game changer in the nuclear debate because of the sophisticated technological analysis that it instigates, bringing a kind of comparison between present cost and future benefits. In what is known as the open cycle, where the uranium fuel is irradiated only once before it is stored, what we observe is that reusable waste are rather disposed than recycled or reprocessed in order to avoid weaponization. But the challenge with that is that this waste will become radioactive, larger volumes are maintained, and their lifetime will be about 200,000 years, if not more. But the other alternative is what is known as the closed cycle or the recycle. And this leverages the recycling or reusing of non-irradiated uranium and plutonium from the waste in open cycles. The results are that there will be an increased energy production and there will be a reduction in the waste volume by about two-thirds. The lifetime of this waste will also be reduced. However, the desirability of this process comes at a proliferation cost because the weapon usable pure fissile materials from this process can be used for proliferation, and the technology in this process is very similar to the technology of weapons production. And this is an example of the reprocessing technology, what is known as Purex, plutonium, and uranium recovery by extraction. The third one is not used yet in the industrial scale, but it has been tested in the laboratory, what is known as the P&T, partitioning and transmutation. This further reduces the lifetime of high-level nuclear waste to hundreds of years. Very remarkable, and will also be about 10 to 20 times shorter than the closed cycle. It is utilized by unconventional fast reactors, which are actually reactors that have what is known as a higher neutron spectrum. The neutrons don't have to be in the limited energy that is required for conventional reactors. The waste lifetime also reduces to 500 to about 1,000 years. It has the potential to significantly reduce the burden of high-level nuclear waste on future persons, but poses short-term safety and security risk, as well as high economic demands on the current generation. Kroger and Stankovic 2022 said the period of time to implement any new fuel cycle option is extremely long and should not put finding solutions for deep geological disposals on hold. This has to do with the P&T, the technology in process. But for time, I'm going to move ahead. This compares the different technologies and their implications in terms of cost, uranium consumption, activity, heat, and some other dimensions. It is left to be decided what trade-offs regarding nuclear fuel cycles and intergenerational concerns are economically efficient, ethically responsible, and risk-averse. P&T offers a technological solution to a non-maleficence duty to future generations by reducing the lifetime of nuclear waste. Intergenerational ethics do not outrightly reject nuclear energy, even though it does not also necessarily justify its desirability. Rather, it contributes to the conversation about making a choice between alternative reactor technologies as well as waste disposal technologies. The last part of my conversation today would be the conversation around reversal of transmitted retribution, which we find in Jeremiah 31 and 29 and Ezekiel 18:2. So this theme of the reversal of transmitted retribution and intergenerational justice will be examined. Dr. Braden, can I still take 5 minutes? Thereabout?
Yeah, absolutely. Keep going.
Okay, thank you so much. So the subject of retribution, what is popularly known as the parable of sour grapes, is also used as a basis for emphasizing intergenerational justice conversations in the nuclear age. Useful deliberations on doctrinal themes can be applied to contemporary issues in the fulfillment of the interdisciplinary task of theology. For James Cone, the preservation of Christian theological truth is contingent on the social influences of the church. The reality of injustice and other vices should influence the methodological approach and emphasis of contemporary theologians. The proverbs of the sour grapes in Ezekiel 18 and Jeremiah 31 are means by which the prophets Ezekiel and Jeremiah spoke to their audiences to help them survive the circumstances that they found themselves and to instigate appropriate action towards change. That was said by Manson Lee. The Israelites employed this rhetoric, the rhetoric of the parable of sour grapes, to unequivocally state the suffering of one generation as a result of the misdeeds of their familial predecessors. Clearly, the proverb is not literal. The religious tradition of the Israelites, based on the Pentateuch and the Deuteronomistic history, allude to the generational consequences of sin. So within their context, there was the framework, the idea for this transmitted retribution. In Ezekiel 18, the Israelites must have been utilizing transmitted retribution to make sense of the unpalatable upheavals that they were experiencing. That is the imposition of imperial policies of Babylon on Judah, as well as the looting of the temple. Ezekiel, however, refutes their claim and presents a counter motion that was going to be upheld from that time, and that was that the soul that sins shall die. Rodney Houghton interprets the response of the Israelites as an endorsement of justified suffering. That is, why should not the children suffer for the iniquity of the parents? Because the idea of collective responsibility or multi-generational consequences was at that time a venerated creedal tradition of the Jewish faith. They protested because Yahweh's reversal of generational retribution was going to upset their theodicy. For them, it was normative and perhaps justified for children to suffer the consequences of the sins of their parents. Manson Lee presents the thoughts of Jacqueline Lapsley in his mention that rather than claiming the community is doomed by past action, Ezekiel places the community in an eternal present where it comes to the issues when it comes to the issues of righteousness, sin, and moral action. But in Jeremiah's context of the proverb, one can figure a futuristic sense of the prophet's vision, especially what with the repeated use of the phrase in the coming days, which we'll find in chapters 31. The mention of individual responsibility in Jeremiah 31 for sin sits well with the salvific, restorative, and consolatory theme of the prophetic book. While some authors like William Halliday and William Rudolph equate the interpretations of transmitted retribution in these two books, Houghton considers it more satisfactory to analyze Jeremiah's context as providing a necessary and comforting reversal that will accommodate the promise of the new covenant. Rather than being a disputation, the Jeremiah context is about a future that relegates the parable of sour grapes to the past. Gerald Neon et al. Regards the presentation of collective responsibility in Jeremiah to be in sharp contrast with the context in Ezekiel. Houghton in his article, Are the Parents Still Eating Sour Grapes?, further demonstrates how previous ideologies were renounced in Israel in preparation for a future promise in two other similar passages in the book of Jeremiah. Unlike the rendering in Ezekiel, Jeremiah was not particularly responding to any erroneous view. Rather, it was establishing a provision that will accommodate the future promise. Robert Carroll argues that while Ezekiel mentioned implicitly that the erstwhile proverb was not the basis of the difficulties that the children of Israel were experiencing, Jeremiah did not mention that transgenerational retribution applied to his audience at the time of the declaration, especially with his witnessing of the destruction of the temple and the prophecy to the exiles. It appears then that Jeremiah's context did not attend to the justification of the proverb as at the time when it was mentioned. Hence, it is not certain if he considered transmitted retribution to be a sufficient explanation of the challenges the children of Israel were facing at that time. Lee clears the seeming contradiction between the claims of Ezekiel and Jeremiah by asserting that the prophets, although taking different approaches, were aiming for the goal of the survival of Israel from their unpalatable circumstances. I therefore draw that Ezekiel finds that some in the community use the sour grape proverb to absolve themselves of responsibility for their circumstances. If these events are the result of another sin, at least according to them, then no action or response is required on their part. Thus, the argument that the children suffer from the sins of their ancestors is the attempted manipulation of a tradition that will release those who affirm it from any obligation of repentance or action. Likewise, Jeremiah discerns within the tradition of his community a way forward in the midst of the chaos. Jeremiah does not deny the collective sins of Israel throughout the generations, but he does place a theological claim within the larger framework that includes the day when God will bring such retributive cycle to an end. Jeremiah asserts a freedom for new action made possible by God's promise of restoration. For Ezekiel, survival, which is important, means challenging the tradition so that his audience will claim moral agency. For Jeremiah, survival meant affirming the transitory status of this theological tradition in the light of God's continued activities. When applied to the nuclear intergenerational context, these passages highlight the moral imperative to break cycles of harm and not to impose avoidable burdens on future generations. They illuminate a theological vision in which technological power must be coupled with moral restraint, humility, and compassion for those who will inherit the environmental consequences of their decisions. In conclusion, the challenges of the nuclear age cannot be reduced to scientific and technological dimensions alone. Situating nuclear waste siting within an integrated moral framework that incorporates science, ethics, and theology contributes to a more just, resilient, and morally coherent approach to nuclear waste siting, one that honors the dignity of the present and future generations. The nucleus of radioactive waste, in terms of its toxicity, invisibility, and long life, creates a moral horizon unlike any other human-made substance. Its management demands far-sightedness, humility, and a willingness to acknowledge the limitations of human control over deep time. Scientific competence is indispensable, but without moral orientation, even the most sophisticated containment strategies risk being ethically incomplete. Second, the theoretical paradigm of the common good provides a crucial interpretive lens for the nuclear waste governance, rooted in classical moral philosophy and deepened by Christian theological traditions. The common good offers a framework in which technological decisions must be evaluated not merely for efficiency or national interest, but for their contribution to human flourishing, social solidarity, and ecological integrity. Third, the ethical controversies surrounding nuclear waste siting, including distributive justice, procedural fairness, or even the none in my backyard phenomenon, reveal that public resistance often arises not from irrational fear but from legitimate moral concerns. Equitable siting processes must therefore move beyond technocratic imposition to embrace genuine dialogue, mutual trust, and community agency. Intergenerational justice emerges as the central ethical axis of the nuclear age. The principle of beneficence and non-maleficence take on new significance when decisions made today impose risk or burdens extending across centuries. Nuclear technologies compel societies to reimagine moral time, to extend ethical concerns beyond immediate generation, to preserve options for the future, and to refuse to mortgage the flourishing of those who cannot yet speak. Nuclear fuel cycle decisions intensify this moral responsibility. Whether societies adopt open cycles, closed cycles, or advanced reprocessing pathways, and by the way, in the US for a long time, the open cycle was more, pronounced because of security concerns. But irrespective of what is adopted, and the implications on the volume, on toxicity, on durability of the waste bequeathed to posterity, force cycles are not merely technical systems, but they have moral linkages binding present and future people. The reversal of transmitted retribution in Ezekiel and Jeremiah reject deterministic models of inherited guilt and instead affirm the possibility of moral transformation across generations. Applied to nuclear waste, these texts invite a reorientation from fatalism to responsibility. They call contemporary society to refuse the uncritical transmission of technological burdens, to break the cycle of harm, and to act with compassion towards those who will inherit the legacies of today's decisions. The scientific, ethical, and theological analysis herein converge. The governance of the nuclear age must be approached as an integrated enterprise. Technological solutions, however robust, cannot stand apart from the social, spiritual, and intergenerational dimensions that shape public legitimacy and moral coherence. A truly responsible nuclear future requires not only diplomatic, military, or engineered strategies, but also ethical imagination, not only geological stability, but also social trust, not only regulatory precision, but also theological wisdom. In the end, humanity is challenged to articulate what it means to be just in an era of unprecedented power. We are invited to a renewed commitment to justice, one that honors the dignity of present communities and protects the welfare of distant generations. Through an integrated vision, societies may yet transform the burdens of the nuclear age into an opportunity for moral growth, for communal solidarity, and faithful stewardship across time. Thank you very much for listening. I want to appreciate the GTU, the CTNS, my alma mater, the Federal University of Technology, Akure. I want to appreciate the IRS, the Institute for Radioecology and Radiation Protection, for providing the materials that I used for the scientific dimensions. I want to appreciate the Nuclear Engineering Department of the UC Berkeley and the professors and students that I worked with during my courses and the seminars. I want to appreciate the CTNS as well as Transcends for their remarkable work in terms of the nuclear age. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Toby. That was really, really fascinating. I have lots of questions, but I will not hog the stage, and I will ask others if they have anything that they'd like to ask.
I just want to say that I'm really pleased and excited that Toby is taking up this issue. As you guessed, I think it's an extremely important issue, but it's sidelined. It's almost invisible.
Mm.
Despite its importance, it gets so little attention in contemporary geopolitics. So I'm really glad to see Toby lifting it up and bringing theological and ethical resources to bear. Braden, you've got questions. I want to hear your questions.
Sure. Toby, could I ask you to just stop screen sharing just so we can
Okay.
maybe have more of a chance to see each other in the conversation?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think I mean, I have lots of different directions I can go in, and so I think I'll start with maybe my most speculative question. Since we have Toby, Bob, and Ted all in the same area here, I'm curious, Ted, whether you and Toby have talked at all about how your understanding of the planetary community and the work you've done in nuclear ethics, if you've thought at all about how that engages with the work that you've been doing in astrotheology, and whether there's any connections there between those two
Hmm.
things, and especially in
Braden,
terms of just
it
the
has
physics
not
of
even dawned on me. Good question. Thank you. Ecology, yes, but astrotheology, let me just say I've not thought about it.
Okay. I think my second question then would be, uh, Toby, I really appreciated the way that you're trying to bring in ethical methodology in terms of discussing your framework. But I'm curious, and you probably aren't far enough along in the project yet to have a definitive answer, but I'm curious how you're going to, because it seems your primary method is a deontological, a principle-based framework. But how are you going to reconcile the demands of intergenerational justice with a sort of Kantian understanding? Because if we have a categorical imperative that is universalized, but we don't have to universalize our behavior identically between generations, what is going to do the heavy lifting there in that intergenerational conversation? So I'm thinking, are you moving from strict universalization of maxims or rules to more of a Lockean sort of proviso, in that we need to make sure we leave enough materials for future generations to do, but also not leave them uh, too many burdens to take on as well. So I know that's a lot to chew on, but I think there's an aspect there that needs to be addressed if you're going to be working from a deontological framework in an intergenerational context.
Yes. I think that's a very relevant question. I'm not sure I understand all of it as you have expressed it, but from what I could pick, I think this is where the idea of the comparison between discounted utilitarianism, which is developing an ethical framework that does not include the intergenerational dimensions because of the uncertainties, and comparing that with a a radical, if I'll put it that way, intergenerational concern, trying to look at the interest across all possible generations. And the middle point where Shavna, I mentioned his name, talked about focusing on the near future, limiting the intergenerational this conversation to maybe 500 years or thereabout. And I really think that I agree with his position in terms of developing theories and having conversations. I think that it can extend to as many as possible generations down the line. But I think that in terms of planning and taking action steps, I think it's really difficult, and this is a classical problem of intergenerational conversations, to be able to take steps with so much certainty about what will happen in 500,000 years, for example. A lot of things may have changed. The energy landscape, I suspect, would have changed. And so the question of, for example, of resourcism, of intergenerational resourcism, how much uranium we have left, for example, the current uranium deposit is estimated to be able to sustain the nuclear industry for the next 100 years. So
Mm.
I think that down the line, I think that it is challenging to plan in very specific terms to what will happen in the future. But I think that towards the near future, in terms of 100 years, maybe up to 500 years, I think that this framework that I'm developing, that I'm trying to develop, I think that it will be relevant. So I'm not sure I've answered your question very well, but this will be my response.
Okay.
No, yeah, I appreciate that. I think since you're already talking about uh, non-maleficence and beneficence, I might encourage you to maybe look at the work of Beecham and Childress as a metaphor of looking at things. So, for instance, in their Principles of Biomedical Ethics, Beecham and Childress talk about that beneficence is a more stringent principle than
Mm,
non-maleficence, in the sense of, I can not do harm to everybody on this Zoom call pretty easily at once, but I
mm,
can't necessarily actively act beneficially towards everybody on the call. I have limited resources. I have limited time. We're in different parts of the state, maybe even in the world, and so I think that the conversation that you're having in terms of intergenerational justice, there may be a way to think metaphorically about the way that Beecham and Childress look at the differences between non-maleficence and beneficence, since you're already using those principles.
mm,
Um, and then again, I don't want to dominate the conversation, so I think my last suggestion or question might be, uh, is it possible to look at topping off your framework with virtue? I know it's self-serving to say so, but I think that if we're uncertain about the future, that one way to look at it is to say, well, what kind of future do we want to leave future generations?
mm,
And that if each generation approaches the conversation in that sort of perspective, then the virtue of future flourishing, or we could talk about what virtues might be involved in that conversation,
mhm.
could be something that helps direct the specification of those principles.
Absolutely. I think that is very profound. I didn't think in that direction. As a matter of fact, I haven't been able to systematize my thought in terms of the different ethical frameworks in terms of deontology and utilitarianism and virtue ethics. But I really appreciate the virtue dimension, and I'll be happy to include that in my ongoing research. I think it's very profound. Thank you for mentioning it.
Sure. Do we have other questions or comments for Toby?
Or maybe responses to the things you
Oh yeah,
have
sure.
also spoken about.
Just want to say it was an excellent presentation, Toby. I really
Thank
appreciate
you.
how wide it is, how informed by science and ethics it is. And it really does help me realize what a profound question is about the long reach of our decisions now into the future
Mm,
of not just human life on Earth, but life on Earth. So
mhm.
you got my full attention. I want to go back and think about it some more with you.
Thank you.
But thank you for this presentation and all you bring to it.
Thank you so much, Bob. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I was wondering if Hongju has some thoughts about the East Asian context in terms of, what is happening, whether in North Korea, the Japanese posture, in China. One of the charts shows that China has the most accelerated weapons development in recent years. Since maybe 2024, thereabout, China added about 100 weapons to their stockpile. So I was wondering, do you have any thoughts in terms of proliferation? I know you're in the train now, so it may not be the best place to talk, but I just wanted to mention that. Yeah.
Well, hopefully those conversations can continue to happen off off camera as well. But I do think that you're in a position where the topic that you're looking at is subject to global pressures and change. I mean, by the time you finish your dissertation, things may have even shifted from when you started. So
Yeah.
it certainly is one issue that we run into a lot in theology and
Mhm.
science, where some of those things are, um, you know, on a very moving platform. Okay, well, if there's nothing else, I think we will we'll end the conversation for now.
Mark hit his hand.
I
Mark,
think that was Mark's thumb. I don't think it was his
Yeah, yeah. I
hand.
was trying to just do a thumbs up. Glad to have been here and heard it and to have heard it, understood a lot more. Thank you. Thank you for letting me be here.
Thank you so much, Mark. I appreciate your presence. Thank you so much.
Okay, let's thank Toby one more time.
All right. Bravo for Toby.
Thank you so much. Thank you.